Today, I'd like to discuss, just share if I can, the screen. Okay, today I'd like to discuss some of the mitzvot that have to do with agricultural laws incumbent upon us as we return to Israel. There's a whole series of them. Today we'll look at what's commonly called the matanot la'aniyim, the gifts to the poor. Those halachot, those laws that are connected to harvesting and distributing surplus food that a farmer may have in order to help out the poor that exist. There are, of course, many other agricultural laws, and we will speak about those as well as time goes on. The counting that we're following is the counting of the mitzvot according to the Sefer Chinuch. The Sefer Chinuch counts mitzvah number 216 through mitzvah number 223 as mitzvot connected to matanot la'aniyim, gifts to the poor, as well as mitzvah number 592 and 593. And if you have the source sheet, you can see the mitzvah that I'm referring to. Mitzvah number 216. This is the mitzvah of leaving over an end of the field unreaped for the poor. Right? These are what we often call the corners of your fields. The farmer would not harvest his fields completely, and then the poor were allowed to come onto his field and collect those corners, really the end of his field. They could collect them for their own well-being. Mitzvah number 217 is the negative, meaning there's a positive and a negative actually for all of these mitzvot we're going to see. There's the mitzvah of leaving it over. Then if you didn't leave it over, make sure, this is the next mitzvah, that you don't harvest to the very end. There is then mitzvah number 218 and 219. This has to do with leket. Leket is the mitzvah of gleanings, that when a person is harvesting and let's say they drop one of the items they're collecting, let's say it's a stalk of wheat or a legume, they drop it, they're not allowed to pick it up, but rather a poor person that might be following them can pick that up in its place. That's leket. That also has a positive and a negative, right? Leaving the gleanings and not to gather the stalks. Mitzvah number 220 and 221, and actually 222 and 23 refer to mitzvah connected to grapes. The grapevines have a unique status in Jewish law. We'll have to ask why that is. So number 220 says you leave the end of your vineyard. It's parallel to the first mitzvah, 216, which is called Peah, the corners. Leave the end of your vineyard unreaped for the poor. Now, the way that's actually understood by the Talmud is not that you leave a specific corner of the vineyard unharvested during the vintage, but rather if there are grapes that never really form into proper bunches. So bunches, usually there's a top, there's a bottom, they drip. If they never really form, so those are what are called the corners in this regard. The mitzvah is called ololot. Those you should leave. And again, there's a negative not to reap those. And then there's a parallel for grapes to leket. Leket is the gleanings that were dropped. So there's something called peret, and that is if grapes fall to the ground, you're not allowed to pick those up. Those are also for the poor. And then finally, mitzvahs number 592 and 593. Those are the mitzvot of shichacha, of forgetting. If you're harvesting and you pass by a certain stalk or a tree that was just actually recently went up north and collected olives. And if the olive trees all look the same, I thought I was going in a row and collecting them in an orderly way. But then when I stepped back, I may have missed certain trees. So if you are harvesting and you pass by something that you thought perhaps you did, or you forgot to pick it up, or you forgot to, not necessarily dropped it, you forgot to harvest it in the first place, you're not allowed to turn back. The Talmud says specifically, do not look back, but simply go forward. You have to leave those things, the shechacha, you forgot them. Those also go for the poor. There's actually a little bit of echo, if we want to be a little bit more theological and perhaps dramatic. That phrase, do not look back, reminds me of Lot's wife. Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom and Gomorrah, these are the two great evil cities in the time of Abraham. And one of the things that made them evil They lacked total hospitality. They lacked chesed, kindness, caring for those less fortunate. And the command is do not look back, almost as if do not draw any inspiration or strength from the evilness of that city. There's also a practical effect. If you remember the story of Lot and his family running away, don't look back, that the city is going to be destroyed. So don't waste any time. Just get out of there. And of course, Lot's wife does look back, and she's turned to a pillar of salt. There's a image there, I think, of here too, when we collect these food items, don't look back. Don't regret that you're helping out a poor person because you have forgotten. So those are the basic mitzvot we're going to look at today. Now, the Sefer Chinuch actually includes all of them in terms of explaining their meaning in mitzvah number 216. It's not that 217, 218, 219, and on, the mitzvah of leket, the mitzvah of the grapes that fall to the ground, the mitzvah of shichacha. It's not that they're not independent mitzvot, but he says that the logic behind them, the meaning behind them, is really the same. So he puts the explanation all in the explanation of mitzvah number 216. Now, before we get to the Sefer Chinuch's explanation, I want to provide a little bit of context, because all of these mitzvot, these are what we would call food justice mitzvot. Mitzvot that try to make sure that our food is consumed and distributed in a fair and appropriate fashion. And to understand just how radical the nature of these mitzvot are, you have to understand the world in which ancient Israel existed, because in many respects, these laws are in response to and rejection of the prevailing attitudes related to food and power, really, that the food represents in the ancient world. So I'll just give two quick contextual points. The first is, thanks to this book I was reading called An Edible History of Humanity by Tom Standage. He begins by pointing out that civilization itself, history itself, is really a product of the development in food and agriculture. He notes, for example, early on, most people were hunters and gatherers. That meant they ran around in very small groups, 6 to 12 people. They would be able to perhaps gather enough food for a little bit and hunt if they were successful, maybe twice a week. And they were constantly moving. That was what society, for a good portion of human history, was hunter and gatherers. And one of the interesting things about being a hunter gatherer is because you had to move and follow the herd. Because of that, materialism, acquisition of physical items, was frowned upon, because you had to move with these items, and it wasn't always so easy to do. And therefore, there was a certain element of equality and simplicity in these early hunter-gatherers. And it was something fairly positive in that regard, that people who showed off and probably tried to collect more items than they needed were looked down upon. Now, he says, of course, these were terrible societies in other regards, because they were constantly moving. They were not able to grow their families too much, so there was infanticide to keep the numbers down. There was potentially cannibalism. We shouldn't romanticize, but at least in this one area, there was something seemingly positive that was replaced with agriculture. Once human beings were able to domesticate wild crops, and they realized that they could sustain themselves from these crops as well, things began to change. First of all, of course, humanity became much more sedentary. They located themselves in cities. Cities, in and of themselves, had their own, represented their own, let's say, moral dilemmas. If you're allowed to create a surplus of food, which did in fact take place in time, so then there's perhaps more time to get into trouble. It's not by coincidence, I think, that most early Jewish leaders like Abraham, Yaakov, they were shepherds. Symbolically, it meant that they were always on the move, not just physically, but I would say spiritually as well, whereas the city life represents sort of a more sedentary lifestyle, and also perhaps on a spiritual level, people were more sedentary. I mentioned Sodom and Gomorrah earlier. Sodom and Gomorrah, the Torah tells us specifically, was a well-watered place, meaning it was successful when it came to agriculture. There were irrigation that enabled the city to prosper. But with that prosperity came moral degradation. And so the Torah, in a sense, is warning us about that danger as we develop. Obviously, development is a positive, but it has to be taken into consideration the dangers that it brings along. In any event, so these cities began to develop and they produced surpluses. Now, once you had surpluses, you often had a couple of other results. One of them was that you had people using their surpluses as money and as power when you could store the food. Literally, it was a way in which people were paid. And what once was a very egalitarian society became a hierarchical society. Those who were more successful in their farming, those that acquired more land, they were able to have more power. And very often food was used as part of that power to pay people, to join armies, to control others, to tax people. The state was providing the irrigation, the state was providing a certain amount of order. And so that surplus was also used to punish people, to withhold. And so that was one thing that developed. There was a great deal of inequality that developed, and we've been struggling with that inequality ever since. And so farming, of course, brought many wonderful things, brought food and sustenance to many more people than before, but also it was used as a way of creating a sense of inequality. And rulers used it as a form of power. Also, it created a certain, that surplus also created a certain amount of religious ritual, right? Many of the people, for example, in Mesopotamia believed that you had to feed the ground, which was a way of feeding the gods to ensure that you had a successful harvest. And so we have examples where food went to waste because it was basically buried with people, because dead were also considered a form of gods, and so you had to feed them, or food was simply sacrificed and destroyed in the belief that doing so enabled the land to become more fertile, because the gods would look positively upon us. There's discussion, for example, of the Noah equivalent story of Mesopotamia, that when Noah and the world was destroyed and Noah was able, not Noah, but the equivalent, was Enki, I believe. So when he was able to survive, the gods, and he gets off the boat and he offers a sacrifice, the gods swarmed around his sacrifice like flies, it said, because they were hungry in that image, because there were no humans that provided them for food. And so humans serve the gods by producing the food. So that's one of the things you can do with surplus. You can give it to the gods. This is different than carbonot sacrifices in Jewish law for a whole series of reasons. God certainly doesn't need our sacrifice. God doesn't eat our sacrifice. We don't anthropomorphize God. It was really bringing the sacrifice was a way of thanking God. Take those things that are most material to us, most special to us, and elevating them to God, meaning we actually ate the food we brought as sacrifices, but we first showed that it was thanks to God that we had them, and we would eat them and benefit from them and expand on our thankfulness of God. And of course, the laws that I'm talking about now is a different way of dealing with your surplus, not giving to the gods, not using it as power, but the opposite, giving it to the poor. And so that's one context. I think the other historical contextual point that's so significant, of course, is our own unique exodus from Egypt. Egyptian society clearly used food, right? The Jews originally went down to Egypt because of a famine. And the Egyptian people became enslaved because of a famine as well. And they had to hand over their foods, their farms, and they became serfs to the Pharaoh because of a famine. He controlled all of the wealth, which was all of the food, and people began to sell their farms, and they sell their animals, and they sell even their seeds in order to get food, in order to live. And so therefore, you again see the power of food to create injustice and inequality in the world. It's perhaps not by coincidence that when we leave Egypt, the way we celebrate that exodus is by having a meal. Right? The Seder meal is an expression of our freedom, and we actually make the central part of it eating different foods. And part of the eating of the foods that we choose in and of itself is an act of rebellion against what Egyptian society represented. And clearly these laws that I'm going to talk about today are also a rejection of Egyptian society in so many ways. Jewish law is a rejection of not just that we escaped Egypt, but we escaped Egyptian mentality. There's a lot of things in Egyptian society that focuses on the dead, right? Their Bible is the book of the dead. And so in contrast to that, we focus on life. God tells us again and again, choose life. The priests in Egyptian society had tremendous power, tremendous wealth, and we had to follow their sort of mystic laws without question. Our priests, and by the way, I should also point out that their priests had tremendous power because they controlled the access to the afterworld. When you would die, you had to do whatever they said, and they may ask for money as a result in order to get to the afterworld. Our priests can't have anything to do with the dead at all. Our priests are not allowed to keep their laws secret. In fact, the entire book of Vayikra, Leviticus, is all about the priestly laws. And so a lot of what we do is a rejection of Egyptian society and what was perceived as the evil elements of Egyptian society, and so too with food. So the laws we're going to see are a direct rejection of that Egyptian society. I should point out one last contextual item is not of a place we're leaving, but the place we're coming to. When the Jews return to Canaan, the land of Israel, there were Canaanites who had their own forms of ritual. The word in Hebrew for grain is Dagon. Dagon was a Canaanite god of fertility, and the priests, the Canaanite priests, controlled, according to the understanding of the Canaanite people, controlled the weather. And here too, you would have to have sacrifices to their gods to ensure a fertile harvest, successful weather, and things all along those lines. And here too, it's rejecting in that regard. So let's now look at the Sefer Chinuch, see what he explains the reasoning for all of these mitzvot. We can get a sense already just from the nature of the mitzvot themselves. But let's look at the Sefer Chinuch because he actually says something to me that's a little bit surprising. So that's the first source. The source does not appear well here. It can also be found on Shir. I'm happy if anyone's watching this video elsewhere to send me an email, Shir Hadash 613 at Gmail. That's spelled SHIRHADASH 613 at gmail.com, and I will be happy to send you a source sheet. The Sefer Chinuch says as follows. On the mitzvah of Peah, and as I mentioned, he gives his explanation on mitzvah 216 about Peah, but he really says it applies to all of the mitzvot we're going to talk about. You leave over the corners of your field. To leave over a corner from the produce, as it is stated in Vayikra 19:10, to the poor and the stranger shall you leave them. After it's mentioned, you should not finish the corner of your field. You should leave the field for others. And the understanding of the stranger here is a righteous convert. We can talk about that some other time as well. But at the end of the day, as he goes on to point out, it's not just righteous convert, the ger, the stranger, but ultimately on a practical level, if there were non-convert strangers, non-Jews living in the land, what we call a ger toshav, they too, you should make sure that they too can collect the food necessary. So that's his basic explanation of the mitzvah itself, where the source it appears. Just to give a few more details of some of these mitzvot, and then we'll actually look at what the Sefer Chinuch says is the reasoning behind. I've taken this from Rav Eliezer Melamed's book, the Pinei Halacha, the Pearls of Halacha, where he gives, I think, a fairly good explanation of these different mitzvot, but they appear in many places. They appear in the Rambams, as I said, Matanot La'aniyim, in the Mishnah Torah. Sefer Chinuch himself goes into all these ideas as well. Many of the Shulchan Aruch explains them, although I would point out, interestingly, there are some rabbis who totally ignore these mitzvot. And It's an interesting question. Why Rav Hirsch, for example, who wrote in Chorev, the explanation of so many mitzvot, skips over. There's no mention of these mitzvot of Peah and Shechacha and Leket. And to a certain extent, we understand why. He's speaking to the modern German audience in the 1800s, and agriculture was far from their daily lives. And so perhaps he didn't feel it was relevant to them. Perhaps he wasn't as familiar with them. And one of the beautiful things about returning to the land of Israel is, in a sense, we redeem mitzvot that have been forgotten, because these are connected to the land itself. Indeed, that's the main halachic position, that these mitzvot only apply in the land of Israel, on the land of Israel. And they wouldn't necessarily apply elsewhere, although perhaps the echoes, meaning the protection of the poor, may still apply on some level. I'll give you just one example. One of the other mitzvot that is not connected to agriculture on the surface is that we are not allowed to cut the corners of our hair. You have to have sideburns. We're not allowed to cut this area like that. The Hebrew for that is peah, the same word of not cutting the corners of your field. And the justification, the explanation of this mitzvah, when you look at the Sefer Chinuch, for example, he says it has to do with not appearing like the pagans. Apparently, this is one of the ways that they would appear, and distancing ourselves from them in appearance, as well as obviously their immoral behavior, the sacrificing of their children, and things along those lines. But I think perhaps the mitzvah also envisioned a time when Jews would not be as connected to agriculture. Let's say, for example, the Jews of Rav Hirsch's time. And we needed some type of reminder of the values of the mitzvah that the agricultural laws taught us. So don't cut the peyot, the corners of your head, your hair, might in fact be a way of remembering this mitzvah, not cutting the corners of your field, that even if we don't have a field that we can now leave to the poor, at the very least, we can remember that we have an obligation to the poor. And so that's one possible way of connecting the two. So in the first paragraph that you see of the Peah Halacha, he gives us the verses in the Torah that explain these various mitzvot. His opening line, he says, Klal hamatanot halu chamesh. There are 5 general mitzvot, 5 general gifts that a farmer is obligated to give to the poor. They are Peah, Shechacha, Leket, Beret, Ve'olalot, and those are the 5 we previously mentioned, at least briefly, up above. He then gives the sources for each of them. He then goes on, if you look in the second paragraph, and notes that there is a distinction between different types of produce from the ground, right? He describes at the Peah Leket, at the time of the harvest. It's interesting to note that it's the harvest time. I mean, most of these mitzvot only apply at the time when you go out to harvest. It's not an all-year type of mitzvah. You don't have to leave the corners always available. It's when you're harvesting that it makes sense. It's when you are collecting the grains that it makes sense if something falls that you have to leave for them. If you drop 1 or 2 of the, let's say, sheaves of wheat, so that becomes leket. You're not allowed to pick them up. The poor can pick them up instead. However, points out, he says, if you drop 3 or more, so then that's the owner. The owner is allowed to pick them up. He's not supposed to lose a tremendous amount. So if it's 3 or more, he is able to pick them up. That's not called a gleaning. But if it's only 2, then you have to, in fact, give it to them. If you go down, he explained that that's called leket. And he explains at the end of the third line of that second paragraph, Nikayemet b'tvuah, and this is established for produce, kitniot v'yirakot shechayvim b'peah. The legumes and vegetables, and grain, things along those lines, those are all obligated in peah. Aval b'peirot ha'ilan, but the fruit of the trees, ein mitzvah kazot. There is no mitzvah of peah. There are other mitzvot. Right? There's tithing and some of the mitzvot that we've spoken about as well. They do apply to trees, but the mitzvah of leket doesn't apply to trees, fruit trees. However, milvad the batzir anavim, except in the vintage of the grapes. When you're doing the harvest of grapes, grape trees, as we saw, grapevines, as we saw above, there is a mitzvah of leket. She'im nafal anav echad or shnaim, if 1 or 2 grapes fall, then there's a mitzvah to leave those for the poor as it says, and we've seen this verse already, when you harvest them, the katsir of your land, lo techale peah, don't cut, destroy, don't reap completely the corners of your field for the harvesting purposes, but rather you shall leave them. And this is called feret, right? The last line of feret, karmecha. The things that have dropped, they are of your vineyards, that you shall leave. You give them to the oni, the poor, and the stranger. Tazovatam, you shall leave them, because I am the Lord your God. If you look at the next paragraph, again, these are just some introductory notes so you have an understanding of the general nature of the mitzvot. The kvi lamadnu anavim hem Peah Leket yachid sheyesh bo mitzvah makbila leket. As we've said, most fruit trees, there's not a parallel mitzvah to leket, the gleanings, but it is true that we have that with regards to grapes, and that's peret. Then he also points out there's this additional mitzvah of olalot. Olalot is that if the grape doesn't, it's parallel to peah, the corners of your grape vines. In this sense, though, on a practical level, it doesn't mean the actual corners, but as I said, it's when the grapes don't fully form into bunches. Those two you have to leave for the poor. The question then arises, why do we make a distinction about grapes? And Rav Melamed answers this based upon a Rambam, based upon many others as well, who point out that there's a special obligation with grapes because grapes gladden the heart. The owner should want to gladden the heart, misamech, the poor. That's really the essence of the mitzvah, even more so than providing food. The Rambam writes in with regards to charity, for example, that if you give it and you give it in a way that makes the poor person feel worse, you don't do it with a smile, that's even worse than not giving at all. That the goal is to misamech, is to bring a certain amount of joy to the person. Perhaps our harvest times, which are also the times that we would give our food away as farmers, are also connected to our holidays, because it is during our holidays that we have an extra mitzvah of being simcha, of being filled with joy. And when you are in a state of joy, you are more likely to share that joy with others, and perhaps they're connected in that regard. And the Rambam says that it's an essential element of the entire process, to be filled with joy and to fill others with joy. As an aside, I remember that Shlomo Carlebach once commented about the famous fight between Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. You recall that the fight they had actually caused the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. There were two individuals who had similar names, and one individual was having a wedding, and he sent out an invitation to one of them, and apparently it arrived at the other, and he shows up at the wedding, and they had been in a fight previously, and he says, "You can't come into my wedding. Obviously, this is the wedding of my daughter. I don't want, you to appear. I don't want you to come." He says, "Yeah, but I'll be embarrassed now. Let me come. I'll pay for my meal. I'll pay for not only my meal, I'll pay for others' meals. I'll pay for the entire wedding." And nevertheless, they doesn't let him in. And Shlomo Carlebach said, "What a sad person." Because can you imagine what you would feel like, what you should feel like at your child's wedding? You're overcome with such joy and happiness that someone comes along, even if you don't like that person, but you're overcome with such joy, you share that. And of course, at that point in time, small petty matters should disappear because you're so overcome with joy. The natural thing would be, of course, come on in, even though you didn't invite him. At that point in time, you're filled with such happiness. And so you think about how sad that person is that he didn't experience this joy, that he could therefore bring the joy to others as well. And so here, the halacha is that we give an extra focus on joy, which is identified with grapes, which of course are identified to wine. Tillim says that wine gladdens the heart. And then there's also a practical benefit. This is also before the holidays. And of course, for the holidays and for Shabbat, we need to make Kiddush. And so therefore, you would also need additional grapes in order to provide for the needs of the holidays. And so you see there, he says that the mitzvah of grapes is unique. Today, sheyachlu lismach, so the poor can rejoice b'yayin, sheyachinum anvei feret v'olot, from the grapes that they would produce from the gleanings that they take of the grapes. Just moving to the next source page of the sources. Um, a few more just technical things. The mitzvah of giving to the poor, and this is a mitzvah we'll come back to because it's an odd obligation if you think about it. המצווה להניח את המתנות לעניים בתנאי שעניים עומדים לבוא לקחתם. The mitzvah of giving or leaving the gifts for the poor is on the condition that the poor themselves are coming to take them. But when you know that the poor are not going to come and actually take the items, let's say, perhaps the poor live way too far away from your field, so therefore there's no chance that they'll actually make it and come there, then you don't have to leave it for them. The idea is that if you left it, it would probably be eaten by, ravens or something along that line. You don't have to have it go to waste. Rather, you can take it for yourself. Now, what's the other option that you might think? Well, why doesn't the owner collect it himself and then bring it to the poor at their homes? The Rav Melamed, again, and others say, no, there's no mitzvah to do so. The mitzvah is to leave it for them, that they then have to come. Now, I've spoken about this idea before, about the Jewish understanding of social welfare is a two-way street. The owner has to give, but the poor should not simply receive. That part of their own self-esteem, part of their own sense of self-worth is dependent on being self-reliant. And so therefore, many of the social welfare platitudes within Judaism require the poor also to participate. In this case, they had to go and actually collect the food. There was work involved. If you look at the story of Ruth, when she goes out and collects, it was not an easy thing. There's a lot of heat. They need to drink a tremendous amount of water. There's work involved. One has to work for this. Similarly, the gifts we give to the Kohanim, the priests, there are certain tithes that we give that we'll talk about later. The Kohanim did work for that. Many of the ideal forms of sustaining someone who is in need require a reciprocal nature in that relationship. So, for example, it's more ideal to give a loan than it is to give a gift. It's more ideal, even more so, to create a partnership that a poor person can join in with you. Judaism is neither socialist in the sense of just providing for everyone without any conditions, nor the pure capitalism of not providing at all. But there's a synthesis of both of these values that take place together, and you see it again and again. This is just one example where it says that the food is there for the poor if they come and take it, but if they don't come and take it, then it goes back and reverts back to the owner in that regard. If we just jump ahead, where you see the two sources, Mishnah, Peah. Peah is the Mishnah that includes many of these mitzvot that obviously deal with Peah and these other ideas and Leket and the like. Just gives us a general definition. Klal amru b'Peah, with regards to Peah, how do you know something is obligated in leaving the corners for them? Kol shehu ochel, it has to be ochel, it has to be food that you're leaving. If you're growing something that's not normally used for food, maybe it's used, let's say, in a time of famine that humans would eat it, but if it's generally not consumed by humans on a regular basis in a normal year, so then it's not obligated in Peah. It's guarded. It's the next word, v'nishmar, meaning it's not hefker. Hefker means I make it ownerless, so anyone can take from it. Well, if you make it hefker, then there's no obligation in Peah. But if you guard it, someone were to come and try to take from your crops and say, no, that's mine. So then that's clearly not hefker. It's guarded instead. So if it's guarded, it's also obligated in Peah. Gidulav min haaretz, it draws its strength and growth abilities from the land. This might come to exclude something like mushrooms, which the rabbis understood draws some of its growing powers not just from the ground, but rather from the surrounding air as well. The picking, ulkitato, kechat, it's all harvested at one time. Olives, for example, there's a season. You harvest it in late October, beginning of November. You don't pick it in March. And so things that are picked throughout the year, there is no obligation in Peah. So for example, figs, apparently figs, you can pick at many different times throughout the year. So there's no obligation for Peah with figs. And when you store them in the room, they can last for some time. That's most harvesting, of course. But there's some things like certain greens, they'll go bad right away. And after you pick them, those you don't have an obligation in Peah either. Chayav and Peah, all these things are obligated in Peah. Okay, so now we have a general understanding of the nature of this mitzvah, some of the details. Let's now, as I said we would do before, look at how the Sefer Chinuch explains this mitzvah. And there's no doubt that when a man leaves a portion of his fruits in his field, the Sefer Chinuch up until now has actually spoken about mitzvah number 16, which has to do with Pesach. And he says that many of the things we do by Pesach, Passover, are symbolic, and it's because symbolism influences a human being. He says the symbolic acts that we engage in, the behavior in general, proper behavior creates and influences proper theology. And so therefore he views it as an educational process. A lot of the physical things we do is an educational process to inspire us theologically. And so he makes this point. He then continues where we're picking up now. There's no doubt that when a man leaves a portion of his fruits in his field and he abandons them so that those in need should benefit from it, he shows about himself a satisfied will and correct and blessed spirit, and that God may be blessed. In other words, leaving it behind is a sign that you yourself, the owner, is satisfied, is content with his lot, and he appreciates what God has given him and has satiated him with his good, and his soul will also recline in good. But the one who gathers it all into his home and does not leave over blessings that the destitute saw in the field in its fullness and now want to eat themselves because they were hungry, does not benefit from it. He shows without a doubt about himself an evil heart, a bad spirit, and it cultivates this negative spirit. You take it in. And you're selfish with it. It shows that you're selfish, and it encourages and confirms your selfishness. And that's why Chazal say in Sota, in a measure that a person measures, so will he be measured. There's karma. Whatever you do is likely that you will be paid back with that as well. And indeed, if we go back to the idea I mentioned before, but that there's a certain amount of obligation and reciprocal nature with the poor in a lot of these mitzvot. The Mishnah points out, for example, that a person who doesn't need to take from the tamchui, which is a source of food for poor people in every town, you have to be below a certain minimum income and assets in order to take from this source of food. And if you don't need to take from it, meaning you have, a much higher level of income or wealth, but you simply want to steal and cheat the system a little bit, at the end of the day, says the Mishnah, you will, in fact, need to take from it. You pretend to need it now. Well, your punishment will be that you actually will need it. And these other examples, a person who pretends to be lame and blind to get benefits, so eventually he may become lame and blind as well. So it's another example, of course, of the poor having responsibility. They shouldn't take if they don't actually need. But the deeper point here is that a person, the way he behaves, he should expect that he will be treated in a similar way. And therefore the Sefer Chinuch goes on and says, therefore you, Baal Hasadeh, the owner of this field, you should make sure to give to the poor so that you will be treated well by God. Now, the reason why I say this is a little bit surprising of an explanation of the mitzvah is because the emphasis seems to be on the wealthy person, on the owner of the field, that it should be good for him, so therefore he should give to the poor. Now, it's a nice theological idea, and there's actually, I think, a certain degree of practical wisdom in this as well by focusing on the obligation of the wealthy as opposed to the rights of the poor. There is an article by Robert Cover, who was a Yale law professor, passed away, I think, in the 1980s. And he was not an Orthodox Jew, but he certainly had a warm spot for Judaism. And he was asked to speak about human rights in general and civil rights in general. And he brought the model of Judaism's understanding of rights and obligations. And one of the points he made, which I think is quite fascinating, is he said that there are rights and obligations in Judaism, but the rabbis found talking about the obligations of the giver, a far more successful way of accomplishing one's ultimate goals. In other words, he gives the example of education. There's two sides of education. On one hand, there are people who have the right to an education, whoever they may be, whether they are, we would say, a normal mainstream student or a special needs student, or children that don't have access to good schools. Everyone has a right to a certain education. That's, let's say, a universal value. He says, however, most societies have struggled with ensuring that every child, in fact, has the right to education fulfilled. There's a lot of expenses involved, and a person may have a right, but it's not always fulfilled. You see this certainly in the struggle in America over civil rights and education, Brown versus Board of Education. The court came out and says, obviously, all children, African-American children, have a right to an equal education. But if you look at the results today in terms of actually educational achievements, many of the schools that African-American students are in are failing, and there seem to be no better than before Brown versus the Board of Education. He says, however, what Judaism did is focus on the obligation. It says every parent has an obligation to provide for their child's education, and if the parent can't do it, then it devolves on the community or the Beit Din. And it's an easier way of ensuring that the rights are fulfilled, not by focusing on the rights of the child, but saying certain people have an obligation to provide and create schools and do these things. And he goes on to point out that the language of obligation is really the language of Mount Sinai, where we are obligated in a certain way. And when you make sure that people feel an obligation, you also make sure that rights are fulfilled. But if you only focus on rights do not necessarily bring along successfully that people have an obligation. You say you have a right, great. Well, if I don't have an obligation to provide for that right, I'll defer to someone else that they should fulfill and help you fulfill your right. But everyone eventually will try to squirm out of helping you fulfill your rights, and then who's actually ultimately obligated, and the rights are not in fact fulfilled. He points out, for example, that this language is so strong that he's noticed, for example, in the development of women's involvement in Judaism. He notices what has successfully changed in traditional Judaism, what has not. And he points out that when people who want to make change come forth and say, well, this is my right to do whatever it may be in making some type of change in Judaism, very seldom is it accepted by the traditional community. But when people come forth and say, no, it's not a right I'm concerned with, but it's an obligation I have. I have an obligation, not a right to learn Torah, but I have an obligation to learn Torah. And they can frame it that way and find the sources where they're obligated. Very often it is in fact accepted. So perhaps if we take Robert Kover's insight here, it makes sense that the Sefer Chinuch focuses on the giver and what his obligations are and what it will do for him rather than the taker. But I still find it an odd way of framing the mitzvah, because clearly these mitzvot are about creating an ideal economic system where the poor don't go hungry, that they're provided for. And it seems to me that the focus should be more on the poor, at least in terms of the meaning behind the mitzvah, that we're going to take care of our poor. That seems to me where the focus would naturally lie. And most other sources make the same emphasis on the poor, not on what it does for the rich. I'll give you just one quick Talmudic example, and then we'll return to the Mishnah Peah that gives us many, many examples. So if you look at Shabbat, that's the next source, Shabbat 23a. It's actually is a Gemara that's speaking about Hanukkah, and the question arises whether or not suspicion should play a role in influencing the halacha. What's suspicion? Meaning, let's say you're doing the right thing, but someone may perceive that you're doing the wrong thing. So should that perception change the halacha of what you actually do? The Gemara then gives an example that in fact it does influence, and it quotes a Tosefta about Peah, about leaving the corners of your field. And so suspicion is only one aspect of this whole Gemara, but I think it helps us get another deep understanding of what the focus of Peah ultimately really is. So the Gemara says, where do we say that we are concerned about suspicion? That suspicion, hashash, hashud, that a person is doing something wrong does in fact influence what the ultimate halacha should be. It's taught in the Tosefta that Rabbi Shimon said, on account of 4 things the Torah said, one should leave Peah, the crops for the poor in the corner of the field, specifically at the end of the field. Right? You might think, Peah, if I'm leaving food for the poor, I can do it in any part of my field. What does it matter that I put it at the end of the field or the corner of the field? Why not do it in the middle of the field? Right? I could say this area is for the poor. They can take everything in the middle of the field, and I'll harvest all around them. But it's not permitted. The halacha is that you have to do the ends of the field. Why do you have to do the ends of the field? And there are 4 reasons that are suggested. One, only after one has cut virtually the entire field, right after you've done your harvest, does he leave an uncut corner for the poor. He should not designate an area for the Peah in the middle. I'm still now reading from the Gemara, or this is really, I think, the Mishnah, in fact. He should not designate an area of the Peah in the middle. No, I'm sorry, it's the Gemara of the field in the course of the cutting of the field. The reasons for this ruling are 4-fold, and he then gives the 4 answers: due to robbing the poor, due to causing the poor to be idle, due to suspicion, that's the ostensible hook why we're learning this Tosefta, and due to the verse, you shall not wholly reap the corner of your field. Now, what do those 4 things mean? The Gemara actually goes and explains each of them more in depth. So, for example, the first one, due to robbing of the poor. What might be the case? Well, the case is if a person leaves the Peah in the middle of the field, so there's no way when just an uninterested observer knows when Peah is available for him to take it. Right? If he sees a person harvest everything, but then leave the very end, the corner, he knows now, okay, now it's Peah, now it's time for me to go. But if you leave the middle of the field, there's no way for you to actually know that it's time for you to take your Peah. And so here you have the opportunity for insider trading, insider information to be utilized to the benefit of people closer to the owner of the field. The owner of the field doesn't tell anyone else, but he calls his friend who is poor and says, listen, I'm going to do Peah tomorrow, and it's in the middle of the field. No one else knows because there's no way for them to know if they weren't told directly. The way for them to know directly is that they would see the corner. They can't see what's in the middle. And so the friend comes and takes the Peah, and then the owner harvests everything, and there's nothing left for the, as I said, the uninformed average poor person. And it's not right. There's actually a Mishnah that says that a person cannot benefit their particular friends with Peah. Normally, the halacha is that you do provide charity, tzedakah, to those that are closest to you. You start with that, and then you move beyond. But in this instance, the Torah says, no, you can't give specifically or allow specifically people you're closer to benefit. It has to be open and equal to all. And so therefore you're robbing that average poor person from their Peah. That's the first problem, due to robbing of the poor. The next, it says, due to causing the poor to be idle. Well, if a person doesn't know when Peah or where the Peah will be, because it's in the middle and it's hidden by all the other crops, so he'll come out on Monday. Maybe today is going to be the day that you designate Peah. He'll come out on Tuesday, come out on Wednesday. He doesn't know until you actually designate it and say it and make a pronouncement. Whereas if you leave it at the corners of the field, well, it's obvious. Once you've finished harvesting, now the Peah is available. So you're causing the poor to waste their time. They have to come on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday and do nothing, simply to wait for your pronouncement. And therefore, they've lost out on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. They could have been in another field. It's a very inefficient way of them collecting their needs. And so therefore, you've caused them to be idle. You've wasted their time. Due to suspicion. What's the case of suspicion? So if one leaves the Peah in the middle of the field, the poor will come and take their portion immediately when he designates the area of Peah. Let's say they actually knew. Let's say you took out ads, whatever the case may be, they know when the Peah is available and they come and take it in the middle. The owner leaves the Peah at the end. When the owner then continues to cut and harvest the rest of the grain in the field, the Peah will not be noticeable. It will have already been taken. So now he cuts his whole field and it's a totally empty field. So your average passerby will look at it and say, this person has not done Peah at all. He has a suspicion about the individual who did not fulfill a mitzvah. And therefore, to avoid the suspicion, even though the person did the right thing, you make sure that you leave it at the ends of the field so there will be no suspicion, because it'll be obvious to all that now is the time of Peah. In the last case, is that the suspicion is correct. The person actually is trying to cheat the system and is, in fact, trying to make sure that he doesn't have to do Peah. And so he could say, if he does the middle, that he did Peah, but he actually now harvests it. And he could always look back and say, no, I did Peah, you just couldn't have seen it because it was in the middle. So it allows him to cheat. And so because there's a mitzvah that you actually have to do it, we want to prevent people who might cheat, and leaving it at the end of the field does that. The reason why I bring this Gemara is simply to make the point that the emphasis and the concern in all instances is for the poor. It's not for the wealthy. The concern is that the poor are going to waste their time. They're not going to have access, or they're not going to have equal access. That seems to be the real focus, that a person may cheat their way out of the entire system. The only one of the four that focuses on the wealthy is the suspicion. We might suspect that he might do wrong. And so therefore, we, in a sense, to help him against himself, but that really ultimately is, of course, also a concern for the poor. So how do we understand the Sefer Chinuch that wants to focus on the wealthy, whereas the Gemara now focuses on the poor? And I'll give you from Mishnah Peah itself a number of quick examples. There's probably dozens of such examples. I just grabbed a few that I thought might be interesting, that you see that the emphasis is really on the poor. The first source, this is a very famous case, Ela Devarim She'ein Lahem Shir. This is from the very first halacha in Peah, and something we say every morning when we wake up and we make a blessing over a Torah. We say that there's some things that have no measurement. Usually there's a measurement, before you have to make a blessing, you have to eat a certain amount of food. Or if you make a blessing afterwards, you have to eat a certain amount of food. There's measurements in halacha. But these things have no measurement at all. A Peah, which we've been discussing, of course, Bikurim, bringing in first fruits. There's no minimum, there's no maximum. Appearing and probably bringing carbonot sacrifices when you come up for the holidays. Gimilut chasadim, acts of kindness, right? Visiting the sick, helping out the poor, misameach, rejoicing with the Chatan and Kala. There's no measurement of when you fulfilled the mitzvah and when you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. In Talmud Torah, there is no minimum, there is no maximum, there is no specific measurement for Talmud Torah. And similarly, these are things that you can benefit in this world, as well as then there are things that benefit in the next world as well. I'm not going to focus on that because that's not our actual subject right now. The second Mishnah in Peah says, "In poktim the Peah mishishim." Even though the Torah says there's no obligation of a specific minimum, the rabbis added there should be a minimum. It should be 1/60th of your field. That's not the maximum, but that's your baseline. So even though the Torah, even though the Torah says there is no obligation at all, we're saying you have to do a minimum. And then they actually expand upon that minimum. Everything is according to the godel hasadeh, the size of the field. It's almost like a progressive tax at this point in time. If your field is much, much larger, you can afford to give more than even the 1/60th. So you should give more to the poor in that instance. The fi rova anim, and if there are more poor in your city, in your community, well, then there's a greater need, and because there's a greater need, you should also give more, right? So the minimum of 1/60 grows based upon the needs of the poor, and then also based upon the yield. If you have a particularly good year, you should also then give more as well. Again, there's going to be always two reasons why I bring a particular Mishnah. One is because of the nature of the mitzvah, the nature of the Mishnah itself that teaches us a lesson about Peah, but also the underlying lesson that the rabbis were concerned for the needs of the poor in particular with this mitzvah. The next source is an interesting case of ants. We're now talking, I think, about gleanings, not necessarily Peah. And there's a case where ants take the seeds of certain crops and they hide them in their anthills. And the question is, who owns those that the ants have taken? Are those considered fallen to the ground, or they were taken before the individuals could actually, the farmers could harvest the land, and maybe not. So you see grain found in antholds where the stalks are still standing. Behold, it still belongs to the owner. He hasn't dropped the stalks themselves. So the fact that the ants have brought them down below, they should still be his. After he's harvested, however, and passed over them, those found on the top parts of the anthold, those belong to the poor. Those dropped. Those that are found way below, we assume that those are the owner, that they were taken while the stalks were still standing. Rabbi Meir, however, says it all belongs to the poor. For the gleanings about which there's any doubt, and there would be a doubt, when the ants took it, was it before or after the reaping of it? So he says anything that is of doubt with regard to gleaning, so that those are considered as gleanings, as leket, and so therefore everything that the ants take into the hole go to the poor. Now, again, there's two reasons why I bring each of these Mishnah. One is the Mishnah itself. Here, I think it's a fascinating point. Look how concerned the rabbis are about even the smallest of items, the seeds taken by ants. How much could the ants really take? Which teaches us, I think, two things. One, of course, is a philosophical point of our concern for even the smallest things. Don't diminish small things. Everything can be important. Everything has its value. And on a practical level, wow, like think about how sensitive we should be for the hunger of a poor person. For us, that an ant would take away a few seeds is nothing. We won't even notice it. But for a poor person, it's actually significant. It's actually meaningful. And therefore, you have to come to some type of conclusion. Who owns that? And the rabbi said, you know what? Give it to the poor people in this case. And then again, you have, I think, the idea, once again, of just that there's a concern, an emphasis for the poor. Again, from this Mishnah, we can learn that that's the real concern, right? The doubt of the gleanings goes to the benefit of the poor. Whenever there's a suffix, whenever there's a doubt, always side with those who are hungry. That seems to be the position of the rabbi, so the emphasis is on their needs, not on the needs of the wealthy. Continuing along, Peah, this is from the fourth chapter, 1 and 2. Peah, when you deal with Peah, it's given from the crop while it is still connected to the soil. However, there's now a case that we're going to talk about certain trees, like a date tree that is very, very tall. So normally, a person would simply take the portion that is theirs. Or a grapevine. We spoke about the mitzvot connected to the grapevine. But what happens if the vine is very, very tall and it's hard to reach the parts that are permissible to the poor person? So if you look at the third line in English, even if 99 of the poor say to the owner, you should distribute it, right? Normally we say that the poor people have to take it themselves. But if the 99 of the poor people say, listen, you probably don't want us climbing up your tree. And also, in addition to that, by the way, not just the tree, now we're talking about Peah in general. 99 of the poor people say, you probably don't want us walking all over the field. And one of them says, no, leave it in the field. I want to take it myself. You listen to the last one, since that's the halacha, as we said. It's to leave it in the field and let the poor person come and collect it. So even if 99 of the poor people are willing to give up their right to actually collect, maybe they think they'll get more if they themselves collect it as opposed to the poor person collecting it. We're talking about, obviously, a case where it's maybe not as easy to collect. Nevertheless, if there's one person who says, nope, the halacha is that I want to collect it myself, then you have to listen to him. However, in the cases that I just mentioned, the date palm and the hanging vine branches, where they're very tall and it's dangerous to go climb this tree in order to get it, right? So in that instance, if 99 of the poor say to the owner, leave it there, we'll get it, okay? But one says, no, I wanna, leave it in the field, leave it in the tree, we'll get it. 99 of them said they were willing to take the risk and climb up to get it. And the one says maybe he's a little bit older than everyone else. He doesn't think he can get to it. Therefore, he won't be able to participate in the mitzvah. So we listen to him because that's the halacha. In both instances, though, you see what's really taking place is the favoritism to the needs of the poor as opposed to the needs of the wealthy. Another couple quick examples. Number 5, chapter 5, halacha 6. One who does not allow the poor to gather from the gleaning or the payah, or he gives specifically to one person in particular, as we've already spoken about, he is called a robber of the poor. He's stealing from the poor. It's his property. But no, it's viewed as if he's stealing about him. And it said, do not remove the landmark. This is a reference to other halachot, that when there's two owners and one of them moves the border, he's actually stealing the land of the person he's living next to. So here too, it's as if you're stealing the land, you're stealing the property of the poor when you don't allow them to collect their rights. It's not an act of charity that you're giving them, it's an act of righteousness. You're obligated to give them this particular item. Again, it's focusing on the poor. 7.3, it's dealing with ferret, which are grapes that fall down to their harvest, as we've spoken about. If while harvesting the grapes, and if you look up the third line, one places a basket under the vine where he's harvesting, so that the grapes that may fall, that would be for the poor, fall into the basket. You're allowed to have a basket if you pick bunches, and it's easier just to put it in the basket. But if you're putting the basket there to prevent the poor from getting, so here too, you're called a robber. The same, you're stealing the property of the poor. Again and again, there's many such examples. We could go on for quite some time. The emphasis seems to be on the poor. So why does the Sefer Chinuch say what he says, which seems to be focusing on the wealthy? So I came across a Mishnah that was surprising in and of itself, for a couple of reasons, that I think also perhaps sheds light on this question about the Sefer Chinuch. And that's chapter 6, halacha number 1, still in the Mishnah Peah. Beit Shammai says, that which is made ownerless, hefker. The word hefker we've already spoken about a little bit. You make your field ownerless. When the field is ownerless, right, Peah doesn't apply. If you make your field ownerless only in regards to the poor, it is indeed ownerless. The hefker works. What does that mean? If you say, listen, my field, anyone who is poor can take from it. Okay, so then it's hefker. Anyone in the field can take from it. Anyone who's poor can take from it. But if you're wealthy, the owner can say, hey, get away from my field. I only made this appropriate for the poor. Hillel says it is not ownerless. Ownership is renounced, even for the rich, as in the case of the Shemitah, in the case of the sabbatical year. In other words, you have to make your field totally ownerless so that a poor person and a rich person could come and take from it without a problem. If you do that, then it's in fact considered hefker. And it would be Peah wouldn't apply, and in addition to that, many other mitzvot wouldn't apply, tithing wouldn't apply, things like that. But if you only benefit the poor, so then it doesn't work. So as I said, this is a surprising Mishnah for at least a couple of reasons. One is, it's surprising that Hillel and Shammai are reversed. Shammai usually is from the landed gentry, the one who benefits the wealthy. He seems to be benefiting the poor. He says, we will allow you to say your land is hefker only for the poor, but not for the wealthy. Hillel says, no, you have to have an equality between the poor, which should be favored, and which we normally would think would be favored, and the rich. So that's the first surprising thing, that Hillel and Shammai seem to be reversed. Secondly, of course, that's the halacha. Hillel is right. You have to make your field hefker for both poor and wealthy for it to, in fact, work out. And so the question is, why does Hillel say what he says? Perhaps this might shed light on why the Sefer Chinuch says what he says. So there are, I think, a couple of different possible ways of answering this question. You could give a sort of a technical answer that points out that when a field is hefker, as I said, Peah doesn't apply, but in addition, tithing doesn't apply. Now, tithing is to benefit other people as well. It benefits the Kohen, for example, some of the tithing, or the Levi. So Shammai, when he says that it's hefker for the poor, it works. So that means there is no obligation of tithing. So in that instance, you are benefiting the poor, but you are hurting the other poor, the Kohen or the Levi, who are not allowed to own land. They're not getting some of their tithing. And perhaps Hillel is suggesting that you can't do a chesed on the back of someone else. You can't say you're going to benefit one person, but in the process of benefiting them, you hurt someone else. The Gemara with regards to Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, it says something very fascinating, I think important as well. You remember that Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, all of a sudden recognize that they're naked, and therefore God needs to clothe them. It's an act of chesed, an act of kindness. God clothes them, and it says, "Ketonet or," with what seems to be the basic translation, a leather garment. The Gemara jumps on that, says it can't be that God clothed them in a leather garment. It must mean, the explanation of the word or, which means leather, he said it must mean from a garment in which the leather, the skin, really, of the human beings, of Adam and Eve, benefits from. And therefore, it must be linen. That God must have taken linen or some other plant-based garment and clothed Adam and Eve, and their skin, their leather, benefits from the cool breeze that the linen or other garment provides. But it's not possible, says the Gemara, that it's actually leather, that it came from an animal, this clothing, because that would have been doing a chesed for Adam and Eve, clothing them, while at the same time causing pain to the animal from which the leather came from. And so you learn there are two things. One is, I think, a sensitivity to the animals already taking place in the Garden of Eden. But in addition to that, you can't do a kindness for one person when it comes at the expense on the back of someone else. So that could be Hillel's explanation of why he says it has to be totally hefker or otherwise. Second explanation is that it could be similar to what the Torah says elsewhere, which is in front of the law, there has to be total equality, regardless of your personal circumstances. So, for example, a judge, the Torah tells us explicitly, is not allowed to favor the wealthy or the poor. Now, you can understand why a judge may favor the wealthy. We have to have a prohibition against that. Maybe they go to the same country club. Maybe there might be consideration of bribes involved. Maybe they feel of the same class, and he's more likely to favor that person. But you're also not allowed to favor the poor. You can understand why a judge may favor the poor as well. Right? He takes pity on him, and he allows, therefore, mercy to influence what the law is. And so perhaps this is a similar idea that we have to have an objective truth, and law only works if there's total equality between all people, regardless of your unique situations. Even if the Torah elsewhere is concerned for the poor, when it comes to the application of law, we can't make this type of distinction. Everyone has to be equal. I'd like to develop that idea a little bit, because I think there's two ways of looking at equality. One in which I already explained, that a person feels that they're being taken advantage of because they're not treating equal as someone else. But there's a deeper form of equality as well that requires a certain consciousness. I would almost say it's a God consciousness, that we are all created equal, that I'm not worried about him getting more or less than me, but I'm worried about connecting with this individual because we are equal. We are of the same source. We have a deep, deep human connection between us because of our equality, being created in the image of God. And therefore, it draws me and inspires me to want to connect with that individual. That's another form of equality that I think is important, that the Torah is also concerned about cultivating. And to sort of develop this point a little bit, let me look at Megillat Ruth. The story of Ruth, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The sources in the middle of our page. Ruth, of course, is connected to everything we've been talking about, because when she returns from Moab, remember, she fled to Moab with her husband, who eventually, her husband who passes away. She returns as a Moabite, as a foreigner, as a stranger, and she comes, and they're hungry. Her and Naomi are hungry, and she has to follow the workers of the owner of the field to get the gleanings or to get the peah. And we see that it's really hard work, and it's a struggle for her. And Boaz takes pity on her. Boaz, she doesn't know this at the time, but it turns out he's related to her as well. He takes pity on her and helps her out and says, "You can drink from my water." He says there were some of the young men were harassing her, so you can see how challenging it might be. He tells them they'll stop. He tells her to go behind specifically individuals who will make sure that she gets what she needs as she's collecting the gleanings and the peah. And then in the second chapter, Vitipol al paneha, and she bows before Boaz, who has done this great kindness, and bows to the ground, artza, to him. V'tomar alav, and she says to him, Madua matzati chen beinecha, why have I found such grace, kindness in your eyes? Lakireni, that you recognize me, that you single me out for benefit, that you take notice of me. Vanochi, and I'm a nachriya, I'm a foreigner. I'm a stranger to you. So I want to focus a little bit on the word recognize, that that Boaz somehow recognizes her. Now, this could be a negative. The Akedat Yitzchak actually says the level of the word recognition is a lower level than, for example, yeda, knowledge of knowing a person. You'll see the next source, the Akedat Yitzchak. Since a man is composed of two parts, the physical and the spiritual, he needs to operate with two kinds of perceptions, one which enables him to recognize the material, the worldly, and the other which helps him recognize and relate to spiritual phenomena or spiritual aspects of other human beings. When we talk about knowing so-and-so, we define so-and-so in terms of height, width, color, and we perceive that he is human by a different cognitive process, a process reserved for recognizing intangible abstract concepts. The former process is called hakara, what we said is recognition, lahakir someone. The latter, yediyah, knowledge. When the brothers brought Yosef's blood-drenched coat to their father Jacob, they said to him, do you recognize this? This is the coat of your son. It's a physical item, right? Do you know that it's his? Do you recognize it? This is a term applicable only to material things. When God talks about Abraham, however, prior to revealing to him the impending destruction of Sodom, he says, for I know him, in order that he will command, etc. Meaning God knows the personality, something intangible about Abraham. So recognition in this sense is a lower level than knowledge. And I bring it not so much for, we'll push our Shir further, but just because it's a helpful piece of parshanut, of understanding, interpretation of certain words in the Torah. The Cheskuni, however, the next source, shows recognition as a more powerful, positive word. He's referring to Ben Hasnua Yakir, that amongst the hated he will recognize. Elsewhere in the Torah, it talks about a man who has two wives, one wife he loves, one wife he doesn't love. They each give children, they each have children. And the wife of the hated, who he may not really want to recognize, he may not really want to acknowledge that this is his son and give him equal benefits, and if he's the firstborn, even more benefits than the child of the one he loves. The Torah says he's not allowed to do so. He has to recognize this son. He must recognize, I'm now reading again, he must recognize the son of the hated wife as his firstborn. The reason why the Torah chose the expression recognize here, lakir, is that it is usually when someone wishes to deny a relative some favor that the latter claims he's entitled to, he behaves as if he does not even know, not even recognize such a person. We find such an example in this expression with the situation of Joseph's brothers. They come to Egypt to buy grain, and he pretends not to know who they are. V'yit nacher, there's the same root of what Ruth says. She's a nachriya, she's a foreigner. Yosef appears as a foreigner, they appear as a foreigner to him. Notice, however, that at the core of that root is something very similar to recognition, right? Lahakir. So you have almost a precursor, a telescoping of what's supposed to take place. Is that we're supposed to, V'yit nacher almost could be reinterpreted as you have to transform someone who is a nacher, someone who is a foreigner, into someone to a lahakir, someone that you recognize. And indeed, that's the Cheskuni continues on. The Torah told us that he recognized them immediately, but he pretended not to. On the other hand, when Boaz treated Ruth, whom he had never met, with kindness and consideration, the pasuk we had read previously, she's so astounded that she asks him what prompted him to treat her as if she had known her all along. Madu matzati chen beinecha. What caused me to have found favor in your eyes? Vani nachriya. I'm a foreigner, a stranger. I'm a complete stranger. The Torah demands of the father of his biological and chronological firstborn to introduce him as someone who does not know him as his son. Jewish law decrees that when a father introduces his son in such a way, he is trustworthy and does not have to provide an independent proof of claim. In other words, I'm going back now up to the source in Ruth as well. What the Chizkuni says is there's a power in recognizing someone who you don't want to or you don't think you're connected to, but really they are your relative. They are someone who is a part of you, someone who is similar to you. That the word recognition is actually deep, and perhaps in his understanding could be as deep as Yeda, of really knowing who that person is. Let's reread the verses from Megillah. She falls on her face, she bows down to him and says, why have you been so kind to me to recognize me? If we take the Akedat Yitzchak's understanding of recognition, it's almost as if she's saying, I know why you're being nice to me. You must look at me physically, right? You see the outside, and either you took pity on me, or perhaps, and this is of course what comes in which case then Ruth is more understanding than we realize, is that you like how I look, and maybe you're trying to curry favor with me, and indeed they do eventually marry, and you want to have a relationship with me, but Lakir, I'm a physical entity. And Boaz responds and says, no. I know about you. Ta'azvi avicha. The story is known that you left your father and your mother in Moab and you came here. It's been told about the kindnesses that you did with your mother-in-law Naomi after the death of your husband. You could have stayed there. You didn't. You left the land of your upbringing and you came with Naomi. You accompanied her to a people that had not known you before. Lo yadat. But here Boaz maybe is saying, not a people that didn't recognize you, didn't know who you were, physically, but didn't know the qualities that you possess of your kindness. But I now know those things because I've heard about your wonderful acts of chesed to Naomi and to others. And so therefore he's responding to her and saying, no, using the Akedah Yitzchak's understanding, I know who you really are. I know the type of personality you are. That's why I'm being kind to you. In either event, however, whether you take the Chizkuni or the Akedah Yitzchak, what's taking place here at this moment is a moment of deep recognition, either deep knowledge, I know, Ruth, who you really are, and the qualities you have, like Abraham, or a deep recognition. I recognize you as my family member. I recognize you as someone who I'm deeply connected to, the deep humanity and the closeness we are supposed to have and connected to one another. In other words, what perhaps is taking place in the whole mitzvah of Peah is that there has to be a moment of recognition between the wealthy and the poor. And that's why it's so essential that the poor come to the field. The poor have to come to my neighborhood. Right? There's a distance between us when I just give charity and I never see the poor, or I know it's being sent to the poor neighborhood. But the whole mitzvah of Peah says, no, if the poor doesn't come to you, so then the mitzvah hasn't been fulfilled. They have to be in your neighborhood, in your field. They have to see you, and you have to see them, and you have to recognize them in this perhaps deep and very meaningful way. And so perhaps this moment of connection and interrelatedness helps explain a little bit about Hillel and Hefker. Hillel says Hefker only applies when it's made Hefker for the wealthy and the poor together. If you just have the poor, as if you're separating these two classes of people, then you haven't really fulfilled the purpose. Or maybe there's something deeper that's going on there. I would like to suggest another answer. This is based upon an insight of Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, that Peah is not just a financial concern, but as we sort of got a little bit of hint, there's also a interpersonal, deeper concern on the human level. I would like to say that Rav Aaron Lichtenstein takes us that it goes even beyond that. He points out that the mitzvot of Peah and Shir, not all of them, I'm sorry, but many of these mitzvot are repeated not just in Parshat Kedoshim, which is the sources that we've read today, but also in Parshat Emor, which deals with the holiday season, and in particular, right before someone would bring or is preparing to bring the Omer, the It's the barley sacrificed to the Beit HaMikdash as part of the rituals connected to the holidays. So he says, why is it repeated dafka connected to the holidays? We almost understand why it might come in Parshat Kedoshim. Kedoshim talks about interpersonal relationships. Don't be a thief. Don't use false ways and measures. These are some of the other mitzvot. Don't oppress people with money or words. There's a lot of interpersonal relationships, and this seems to be part of that, right? Gift food to the poor. We know that people are naturally selfish, and so here's a whole series of mitzvot to correct that selfishness. Don't use false weights and measures. Don't take advantage of people. Give to the poor. But why does it appear also connected to holidays? So some people suggest, oh, it's just practical, right? When the holidays in Judaism are connected to the harvest, that's the time that these mitzvot would be applicable. So it's a reminder, make sure you do these other mitzvot as well as you prepare for the holidays. Rabbi Aaron goes a step further. He says sometimes people don't take care of the poor because they're selfish. And sometimes they don't take care of the poor because they think they're righteous. Like the person is preparing the Omer. He's getting everything ready for his trip to Yerushalayim. He's a holy individual. He can say, well, listen, the poor can wait, or maybe they're not as important. I have to do something to serve God. And he says, well, you have to be very careful there as well to make sure that as you go to serve God, you also don't allow that to allow you to shirk your responsibilities to take care of the poor. And you may fulfill the mitzvah not out of selfishness, but out of your righteousness. And therefore, you have to be careful in that regard. I want to end by taking this point of Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, where he begins to transform the mitzvah, and he gets us thinking not only of mitzvah ben adam l'chaveiro, how this relates to our relationship with other people, but he says there's also a side that's connecting to our relationship with God. But I'd like to take it in a different direction and think about the mitzvah of Peah as not only interpersonal, but also a theological mitzvah. This is actually hinted in the Mishnah itself. If you recall before, when Hillel makes a statement, he says, you can't make it hefker for the poor alone, has to be for the poor and the wealthy, just like it is with Shemitah. In Shemitah, it's the land has to lay fallow for both the wealthy and the poor equally. But what we really learn when it comes to Shemitah, of course, is that the land is not ours. The land, we don't own it. Right? We are leaseholders on it. The Torah and Vayikra, you'll see that's the next source, 25:23. The Aretz lo timakir, you shall not sell the land. Why should you not sell the land beyond it being possible to be reclaimed by others? Ki li haaretz, because the land is mine. Ki geirim v'toshavim atem imadi. You are geirim, you are strangers on my land. The language is incredible. Geirim. You remember the Sefer Chinuch points out that the Peah is well, the Torah says it's for the ger, the stranger. And then the Sefer Chinuch tells us the ger that we're talking about is the convert. And others say, no, the ger we're talking about is the ger toshav, the person who lives on the land. Either case, it's a stranger. You have to have sensitivity to the stranger. But he's the other. And we're, in a sense, going beyond our own personal needs to help the other. God reminds us, you're actually the other. You're the other in terms of vis-a-vis my land. I give you the right to use the land. If that's Shemitah, you can use the land, but your lease, the fact that you can't touch it this 1 year shows who the true owner ultimately is. And so if we say that the true owner of the land is God, and we learn that from Shemitah, I would suggest perhaps also making it hefker shows that also who the true owner is. You can't pick favorites. You can't say, you know what, I'm going to help this person and not that person with my land. It's not your land to do that. And therefore, Hillel perhaps could be alluding to a little bit this concept when you make it hefker for both of them, well, then that resorts or returns to its original state, which is the land truly is ownerless by all human beings. And that's God's. That's okay. But if you say it's just ownerless for the poor, but or just ownerless that the poor can take advantage, but you still own it vis-a-vis the other wealthy. So then you haven't made the theological statement that the land is really God's, because you still control the land in that you've determined who can come and who can't. You still control it vis-a-vis other owners. Only when you make it totally ownerless is it then acceptable, because then you make that theological statement. And I want to expand upon that theological statement that might be, in fact, being made. And that's with the next source. If you know the next source, the Midbar Rabbah is following up on a verse in the Torah where it says the Torah was given in Sinai. In the desert in Sinai, that's where the Torah is given. So if you look at the source, the Midrash on that, the Midbar Rabbah, V'diber Hashem el Moshe b'midbar Sinai, that God spoke to Moshe in the desert of Sinai. Why did he speak in the Midbar Sinai? To give the Torah and to share Torah teachings, because one can only accept the Torah if he's like the Midbar. This is where the Torah is given, and therefore we have to make ourselves like a desert as well. And what does it mean to make yourself like a desert? You have to make yourself hefker. There's the same word. The desert is not owned by anyone. It's a vast open space, and you have to make yourself ownerless and vast and open and quiet and humble and lowly, just like the desert, if you want to accept Torah. That's the Midrash. That you can only acquire Chachma and Torah, wisdom and Torah, because Midbar Sinai, you have to be just like a desert. Now, what exactly does it mean when it says you make yourself hefker? Usually when we talk about the word hefker, it's about making items hefker, right? Making your field ownerless. Making, when it comes to Passover, we make our chametz, right? Our bread, hefker. I don't own it anymore. I don't have an obligation to it anymore. What does it mean to make myself hefker, myself ownerless? So I think there's a Sat Emet that sheds a lot of light on that. He explains that hefker usually means rendering something ownerless. Making oneself hefker means understanding that one is powerless, therefore utterly dependent upon God for everything. Right? That's the prime example is when we were actually wandering in the desert. Everyone knew that they could not survive even one day without the manna, without the clouds of glory, without the well. We were totally subject to God's kindness, to God's graciousness. We're Gerim, we are the strangers, we are the other, and God provides for us out of kindness. We're the beneficiaries of God's kindness in this case, but only if you recognize yourself and make yourself hefker, make your land ownerless, and which is really a process of making yourself ownerless, making yourself powerlessness. Hefker consciousness, we train our spiritual sight to see the divine presence that dwells beneath the surface. We have to make ourselves humble and open ourselves up to seeing God everywhere. And also, not only, of course, do we open ourselves up to seeing God when we make ourselves ownerless, that this is all from God, everything is a gift from God, everything's owned from God, but it also helps us ultimately recognize our neighbors in a more powerful way. You see the next source from Rev Menachem Mendel Depps. The Torah only stands firm in one who makes himself like a midbar, hefker, as we said before those who are poor of mind and rich of mind, and he doesn't think of himself as better than his friend. When you say you're hefker, you're ownerless, you have no greatness. So you see other people as equal to you, genuinely. On the contrary, he should be completely nullified, right? To remove all ego, all sense of pride. And when you do that, not only do you let God into the world, obviously into your world, because you no longer think you are the owner of the land, you recognize it's all from God, but you also let other people into your life. When you're completely nullified before your friend, it is through this that they become united and bound up with one another. So I think that's the answer to Hillel, surprising statement about making the distinction between hefker, between the rich and the poor. And it's also perhaps an underlying explanation of why, at the end of the day, the Sefer Chinuch focuses, even though the mitzvah is clearly for the benefit of the poor, it's to create an economic, an economically just society. There's also an incredibly important theological statement that's being made. And you have to include all people in that theological statement about equality. But ultimately, it's not just that. It's about a moment when the rich and the poor have to meet one another. they're involved in this, but the rich can't see themselves simply as a giver. They have to see themselves also as strangers, just like the poor, that they actually realize that we're all in this ultimately together, this thing called life. And when we do so, we enable ourselves to understand God and one another in a much deeper, more meaningful way.